Welcome to the opening ceremony of Climate Week NYC 2020 by the Climate Group. I'm Somini Sengupta, the international climate reporter for the New York Times, coming to you from the Javits Center in New York City. Over the course of this event, we're going to be hearing from a variety of voices, from business, government, from campaign groups, from economists and scientists. This has been a transformative year. We met a global pandemic. We confronted deep-seated racial injustice. We are staring at, the very real hazards that are magnified by climate change. This year, 2020, is shaping up to be one of the hottest years in recorded history. A village north of the Arctic Circle recorded 100 degrees Fahrenheit one day this summer. That's 38 degrees Celsius. A record 3 million plus acres are burning in California. A hurricane has brought catastrophic rainfall over the US Gulf Coast. The big question we'll be asking of all our guests today and throughout the week is, what needs to happen now to build a future that is safer, healthier, more equitable? The big question, the question that matters now. Climate Week NYC 2020 will explore how to tackle climate change faster and more effectively by government, by businesses, by citizens. And because many more of you can join Climate Week NYC 2020 remotely, we hope you'll learn about what's being done, what's not being done, what needs to be done. By whom and for whose benefit? Are the solutions going to be equitable? Will those most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change see their lives improve? What are the trade-offs that need to be made? This week, there are over 400 events taking place here in New York and around the world. It's your chance to learn, engage, ask questions, to discuss where things are going in the right direction, and be open and frank about where they're not. To tell us a bit more about what Climate Week NYC 2020 has in store, I'm pleased to introduce Helen Clarkson, CEO of the Climate Group.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this year at Climate Week NYC. Can I just start by saying how we are so grateful for your continued support. Now, more than ever, even though we are not able to be physically together, thank you for being part of this week. Shortly after last year's Climate Week NYC, our community faced a huge logistical challenge, moving the entire COP from Chile to Madrid in just a few weeks. The Spanish government did a fantastic job, and I think we all reckoned that we could stop thinking about event planning and go back to focusing on the climate. And of course, our focus was drawn straight back, with news of devastating fires in both Australia and California. Across the world, 2019 to 2020 has seen large and unprecedented wildfires, not just in those places, but also places like Alaska and Siberia. Arctic fires in 2019 and 2020 are far above the average level seen in the previous 15 years. And now we're seeing terrible pictures coming out of California and up the West Coast, where residents are once again faced with scenes that Hollywood should be dreaming up, not experiencing. So in any other year, that would be the news we'd be talking about. And we mustn't forget the devastation already being wrought by climate change and the impact it's having on people, especially the most vulnerable in our society. But of course, 2020 is not any other year. This is not the time and place to go over the COVID statistics you know all too well, both globally and from your own countries and experiences. The world is suffering a crisis, one that affects our health, our livelihoods, and our societies. But as the pictures from California all too starkly remind us, climate change is not going to wait while we deal with COVID. Early this year, we started pondering what to do about Climate Week NYC. As the Climate Group, we curate the week annually on behalf of the climate community. And while we couldn't answer the question then of whether we'd be able to meet in person, we knew that somehow we wanted still to deliver a collective moment for our community. If we couldn't gather everyone together in New York, we decided to take Climate Week NYC to the world. So for the first time, we have participants in our events that haven't had to travel, to pay for hotels and plane tickets or cross borders to attend. Our events will be available after first being broadcast on our events platform on Facebook Watch and YouTube, and you'll see lots of videos on Twitter and Instagram as well. We've worked really hard to make this year free and accessible, and we're looking to build a model that continues to allow us to do this even when we're able to come together again. For all these benefits of an online event, I want to be quite open about the drawbacks. We're missing the conversations over coffee or drinks, where you develop ideas with new collaborators, the pleasure of seeing people you've worked with or alongside over the years, and a sense of shared endeavour when you're standing in a room of people who are all working to achieve the same thing as you. These moments are incredibly important to our collective goals. They motivate us, inspire us, and sustain us through difficult times. We must find ways to replicate these as best we can, so please use WhatsApp, email, and our on-platform chat function. It's not the same, but it's what we have this year. And also I urge you to take the time to congratulate people on their announcements, compliment them on their events, and engage with them on their work in progress. As well as those participating from afar, I'd like to take a moment to thank the thousands of people in New York who are participating in Climate Week still, either in a socially distanced way or from their homes. A big thank you for the support of the Empire State Building, One World Trade Center and Hudson Yards, as well as many other classic New York landmarks for lighting New York City green last night. And we also saw the infamous metronome in Union Square transform into a climate countdown clock to highlight the urgency of the task ahead of us. We continue to be grateful to our partners NYC and Company for their support in raising awareness of how to take part in the week, as well as JCDecaux in helping us spread the work of this year's Climate Week NYC. Thank you all for bringing New York City to life for us. This year has split open discourse on many systemic issues, and it would not be right to hold this event in the US and not take time to recognise that the climate crisis is not the only immediate battle we must fight to truly create a better world. At Climate Weeks in the past, we have not done enough to explore the role of race and racism in the environmental sector. We're continuing to make space for conversations on this in our events this year, but we know that we have not got it right yet. We welcome your honest critique and commit to doing better. We must all move forward in our fight, not only for a just recovery, but a just transition. In the last 2 years, we've seen children protesting for their rights to a future on our streets around the world. This year, we've also seen protests against institutional injustice here in the US and in the UK and around Europe. Most of the polling we see indicates that people desperately want change. I've banned my comms team from using the phrases unprecedented and the new normal, but it must be said we've got a huge opportunity to redefine what the world ahead of us looks like. If this crisis has shown me anything, it's that the role of non-state actors has never been more crucial. Businesses and subnational governments are setting agendas that far outstrip the ambitions of their national counterparts. Those of you listening to me today are the leaders of those businesses and governments. You've led the way through COVID by being innovative and responsive and engaging with your citizens and your consumers. Business leaders, if you can move your entire staff to working productively from home within a matter of weeks, what climate-based commitments can you now make with the confidence your team can deliver them if they only have the sign-off to aim high? There's no need to accept the assumption that company-wide changes must take years when you have just proved that argument wrong. Government leaders, we've seen what you can do when the lives of your people are at stake. Those lives are still at stake. We need you to take that spirit of innovation in the face of an emergency and apply it to every single decision you make that impacts the climate. And one thing that's been incredibly strange about this year is what it's done to our sense of time. The days drag on as we work from home. A 2-week quarantine seems like an age. But time is still running away from us. We still need to halve emissions by 2030, and we still haven't done enough. But due to COVID, the next COP talks are also postponed, and we still have 14 months till we convene in Glasgow for what will be the most important COP since Paris. What are we doing to utilise that time? What are you doing to utilise that time? It's on all of us here today to support our national governments in being as ambitious as they can be, and by multiplying their impact with our own far-reaching commitments. In COVID terms, that's 29 quarantines. Don't tell me that's not enough time to get things done. And now, back to our fantastic host, Somini.
Thank you, Helen. I would now welcome His Royal Highness, the Prince of Wales, to address the Climate Week NYC 2020 opening ceremony.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to have been invited to open this year's critical Climate Week. The borderless climate, biodiversity and health crises are all symptoms of a planet that has been pushed beyond its planetary boundaries. Without swift and immediate action at an unprecedented pace and scale, we will miss the window of opportunity to reset for a green-blue recovery and a more sustainable and inclusive future. In other words, the global pandemic is a wake-up call we simply cannot ignore. Having been at this now for well over 40 years, I have long observed that people tend not to act until there is a real crisis. Ladies and gentlemen, that crisis has been with us for far too many years, decried, denigrated, and denied. It is now rapidly becoming a comprehensive catastrophe that will dwarf the impact of the coronavirus pandemic. At this late stage, I can see no other way forward but to call for a Marshall-like plan for nature, people, and planet. With the planetary emergency so critical, with the permafrost melting in Siberia, for instance, producing dire effects on global warming, and with the Pantanal in Brazil being consumed by unprecedented numbers of fires, we can no longer go on like this, as if there was no tomorrow and no ultimate reckoning for our abuse of nature. So, what do? Without doubt, we must now put ourselves on a warlike footing, approaching our action from the perspective of a military-style campaign. That way, working together, we can combat this most grave and urgent challenge. If we have the resolve to shift our trajectory, we must start now by bringing forward our net zero target. I'm afraid 2050 simply suggests we have room to delay. Using the frameworks of my Sustainable Markets Initiative and the imperative of the Great Reset, and knowing that we are all familiar with the problem we face, I would just like to outline, if I may, 5 overall action areas of this Marshall-like plan for which coherent strategies should be assembled. First of all, by COP26 and using a future of industry approach, it would make a very great difference if each of the main sectors of the economy, whether energy, transport, financial services, and so on, were to outline publicly accessible roadmaps that identify the steps to net zero from 2020 to 2030, along with plans for the protection and restoration of natural capital and biodiversity. We have an incredible opportunity to create entirely new sustainable industries, products, services, and supply chains. Moving together with clear roadmaps, we can create efficiency and economies of scale that will allow us to leapfrog our collective progress and accelerate our transition. In these efforts, we can also make sustainable options the trusted and attainable options for consumers. After all, market-leading companies have demonstrated that it is entirely possible to be profitable and sustainable at the same time. In fact, businesses and investments that are ESG aligned are increasingly outperforming those that are not, even in the current economic crisis. In these efforts, we can also make sustainable options the trusted and attainable options for consumers. After all, market-leading companies have demonstrated that it is entirely possible to be profitable and sustainable at the same time. In fact, businesses and investments that are ESG aligned are increasingly outperforming those that are not, even in the current economic crisis. To put these roadmaps into practice in operational terms, we need our financial experts, along with our chief financial officers, to help design the business and investment case to match growing demand for sustainable goods and services. Secondly, having listened to the wise and experienced business leaders who are involved in my Sustainable Markets Initiative, I would also encourage countries themselves to work towards COP26 by outlining publicly available roadmaps to net zero, which set out priority industries for transition, along with the actions required to restore or enhance biodiversity and natural capital. Through my Sustainable Markets Initiative and the Great Reset, I remain committed to working with coalitions of the willing to push these efforts forward. Billions of people around the world are waiting and longing for concerted action to right the balance of this planet that we have so rashly disrupted. Millions of younger employees of countless companies and corporations are desperate for action, not more words. It is their lives we are gambling with, as well as the ultimate survival of everything that tries to share this ailing earth with us. So, let's get on with the urgent task of forming a global alliance to overcome the perverse obstacles facing us.
This has been a year where every country, every business, and every person has had to make big changes in order to cope with the coronavirus pandemic. We've been hearing for years that big changes are absolutely essential to tackling the climate crisis. We've been hearing this from scientists. In fact, they've warned that because we've waited so long, the world as a whole needs to reduce emissions by half in the 2020s, in the next decade, to have a fighting chance at averting the worst effects of climate change. That was the call of last year's Climate Week NYC. This was to be the climate decade. The call was to halve greenhouse gas emissions in the next 10 years. That was a call to boardrooms, to shop floors, to the halls of government where policies are set. Then came the pandemic. 29 million cases, nearly 1 million people dead. What happened to the climate decade? In this next session, Helen Clarkson asks the panelists, what does it mean to be future fit?
Hello everyone and welcome back to our first panel of the morning, Future Fit Business Strategies for a Net Zero World. Please let me introduce our panel. Marc Engel, Chief Supply Chain Officer at Unilever, Professor Rebecca Henderson of Harvard Business School and author of the book Reimagining Capitalism, Mathias Lelièvre, CEO of ENGIE Impact, and Mr. Zhenguo, founder and president of LONGi. Rebecca, turning to you first, in your experience, what are the common characteristics of firms that are really making progress against climate change?
They have a really clear business case, so they're very clear what the economic return is for doing things like reducing energy use or tackling waste. That business case is strongly embedded in their operations, so there are people in charge of executing it and clear metrics on which the firm is committed to making progress. And last but not least, it's not just about the economics and the operations. It's about feeling the passionate case for solving climate and really devoting the organization to making progress against that goal.
Thank you, and let's build on that and turn to the businesses on the panel. What does Future Fit mean to you, and what steps have you taken in the last year to achieve it? Mr. Lee.
At LONGi, we have long contemplated how to make clean energy more affordable and accessible by means of progressive technology and cost reduction. In 2018, when I was at Cambridge University studying for an executive MBA, I met with Professor Martin Rees in one of the classes, where he shared with us that he was very worried about the future of our planet. He was particularly concerned about the damage that human activity had caused to the Earth in the last 100 years. From his course, I was inspired, but I realized that even the smartest brains in the world, who were concerned about the environment, still seem to underestimate the value of solar energy. Ever since then, I have embarked on contemplating the role of solar in future energy. I am convinced that by producing more clean energy, while using clean energy ourselves, we will be able to alter the ecosystem through seawater desalination, and by piping desalinated water to the wilderness. This creates forestation, which then absorbs CO2. Once we realized this idea, we began to share it with the rest of the world. We advised governments, including the Chinese government, that this would be a feasible solution. Meanwhile, we ourselves led by example and so joined the RE100 campaign to clean up our own manufacturing process. We named this action as Solar for Solar, where we produce clean energy with clean energy. We are very committed to this purpose. Thank you.
Marc, tell us about Unilever.
Yeah, thank you very much, Helen. Look, I think at the end of the day, let's say, to be future fit is simply having a strategy that pushes you to embrace the future rather than clinging to the past. And, for us, it's very simple. Our vision is a future of a net zero and socially inclusive world. That's what the world agreed in Paris in 2015. And let's be very clear, that means that we have to halve our global emissions every decade between now and 2050. That's what we have to deliver. And it's taken time, I think, for the penny to drop, but I do think the penny has dropped, and businesses here today who've already started their own transformations are very well positioned for the future. So if I turn to Unilever and I sort of share with you what we've done since Helen, our CEO, joined you last year on the stage in this climate week, in January, with interim target of getting 100% of our grid electricity from renewable sources, with the help of the climate group, RE100 coalition, and it should actually give everyone the confidence that renewable is doable. Then in June, we made our next announcement for the next 10 years around doubling down on our 1.5 degree aligned science-based target for 2030. We introduced a new net zero target by 2039, and we launched a €1 billion climate and nature fund to invest into projects that regenerate nature and lower carbon footprint. And this month, 2 weeks ago, we announced that all of our cleaning brands, our home care cleaning brands, are going to turn off the fossil fuel tap by only using molecules in the formulations that are derived from recycled or renewable carbon. Year journey, but it's a big commitment. And we've already launched products in India from direct carbon capture from chimneys that we turn into soda ash. We've already launched products in Chile and in Vietnam that use plant-based chemicals in our cleaning products. In fact, right across our value chain, we're seeing that we're mobilizing now to this journey. And so, if you look at the journey up and down the supply chain, at least from our perspective, it gives us hope that this journey is doable and it is possible. And if you start with it with passion, as Rebecca called out, you will make it happen.
Great, thank you. And Mathias?
Yeah, thanks. I couldn't agree more with what colleagues just said. It's really the conjunction of three things for businesses to be future fit in a carbon-free world: strategy towards carbon neutrality, an operational plan, a strategic plan, a business plan, with the finance coming with it so that you can see the strategy be translated into action. And finally, that's this idea of thinking systemic. So how do you bring on that same path your supply chain, your suppliers, your clients? Because what you want is that your decarbonization is going to create a competitive advantage for you. And so if there has been a lot of momentum with cities and corporates setting more ambitious and more short-term sustainability goals. At the same time, we are seeing a gap, and that's the research we've been doing with ENGIE Impact, when to translate that into action. And really, only 30% of the companies are on target to achieve these goals. So this link between the strategy and implementation, we believe there's still a gap there, and that we need to go faster in the real concrete actions. When it comes to ENGIE, I've had the opportunity to closely participate in both the internal decisions driving its business model transformation, and it has really evolved over time to also address the question of external clients, to accompany and support clients on that same transformation. And it's been an amazing business story, to be honest. We shifted massively for the last 4 or 5 years, reduced by 50% our carbon emission over the last 4 years, just divesting everything that is related to coal-fired assets, related to oil, to really reinvest only in renewables and clean energy. And last year, during Climate Week, we announced ENGIE Impact to the market, which is really this global business to enable and support clients in their transformation from strategy to implementation. And last year has been all around scaling that globally, that business. And for ENGIE, the work is continuing. So at the beginning of the year, we announced being science-based target compliant. So our reduction continues over the next 10 years, and a lot of focus reinforced on renewables, on energy efficiency, to really continue to drive that transformation for ourselves and for our clients.
Great, thank you. Moving the conversation on to policy, Rebecca, can you share a little bit with us about the role of business in influencing government policy?
Helen, thank you. I'll be most curious what my colleagues on the panel think about what I'm going to say. I'm going to suggest that despite the amazing progress that so many firms are making, and we've just heard of aggressive targets happening at billion-dollar scale and reductions of up to 40–50%, I'm going to suggest that without appropriate government policy, we are not going to get to zero. That completely transforming the power grid, the transportation system, our agriculture, our infrastructure is going to be, at the very least, much, much easier if we have appropriate government policy. And so I believe that a critical part of what needs to happen over the next year or so, or the next 10 years, is for government to step up and say, you need to regulate us. We need some kind of tax on fossil fuels, or we need regulations that drive increased efficiency. I won't get into the policy details here, but I do believe it is really critical for leading edge firms like those that are represented here to be actively lobbying and pushing governments worldwide for the kind of appropriate policy regime we need.
Great. Yeah. Well, you'll get no argument from me. When I talk about the climate group's work, I talk a lot about how we work at the interaction between business and the policy environment. And it's interesting to hear you. Mr. Lee, maybe you can speak to how you're taking action in your value chain and influencing the policy environment.
When LONGi begins to scout for new factories, the proportion of clean energy in the local energy mix has been a significant factor in helping us decide on our location. We are more willing to open our factories in places where a higher proportion of clean energy is available. For example, Yunnan province of China, where clean energy currently amounts for 92% in its local electricity grid. We are in the process of building more factories in such places. We also have factories in other places in China where the proportion of clean energy supply is not yet as high. In such areas, we are urging local governments to increase the proportion of clean energy to enable our business operations in a cleaner fashion. Ultimately, we are still working hard to make sure we deliver our commitments to the RE100 campaign internally. By 2028, if we have not achieved using 100% clean energy, or in the event we still use a small portion of traditional energy, we would then buy green certificates so as to deliver our promise. Of course, we are also extending our RE100 aspirations to our suppliers by encouraging them to produce their products with clean energy as well to further maximize impact. Thank you.
Thank you. Marc, same question to you. How are you taking action in your value chain and influencing the policy environment?
Now, look, I think it's an incredibly important point. It's possibly the most important work. And just to underline what Rebecca said, we fully subscribe to that. With all the billions in fossil fuels, you'll need to grow by 2050. If you don't get a carbon price of around $80 to $100, you will not get there. Don't stimulate public-private partnerships in new technology, zero carbon technology and roadmaps, you will not get there. If you don't create laws that protect rainforest and nature in general, you will not get there. So it is absolutely a very critical point, and we do recognize at Unilever the role that business has to play. So we've been, ever since 15 years ago, we created the corporate leaders group to lobby for the Climate Change Act in the British Parliament. We've been steadily increasing our work in this space, at an international levels through groups like We Mean Business, at regional levels through groups like the EU Corporate Leaders Group, publishing this week that to an adoption of a 55% cut in EU emissions by 2030, through thematic groups like RE100, EV100, advocating for different energy framework in mobility and electricity, and at the national level in the key markets where we operate. It is actually some of our most important work, and fully subscribe that business has a role to play. It's also some of the hardest work, I have to be honest. It's also some of the hardest work because it is not easy to do this stuff, but there's absolutely an important place for that.
Fantastic. And Mathias, could you tell us a bit about how your decarbonisation goals are influencing your planning and decision making?
So there's been a significant shift from corporate clients over the past several years, from really sustainability sitting at the periphery, to be honest, and now being a top priority of the C-level agenda. So first and foremost, it's all about decision making, making sure it comes from the top. You need a strong push to make that type of change happening, and so it starts there, and probably with more transversality across the C-suite and what we can expect. It's not only about operations or finance. It touches, HR for talent acquisition, digital in the way you think about your supply chain, and your partners helping you to continue to stay at the lowest carbon level possible. And honestly, many organizations are doing a rethink in the way they think about how to deploy capital for decarbonization projects or create an environment that changes the behaviors. The complexity is all around going from the central view, the strategic view, to the local level, because that's where the action is happening. And so that complexity is coming from that, just the type of organization. It's difficult, and that's what has just been said, that it's really not easy to implement. And overall, at the end of the day, I really feel like organizations need to manage carbon in the way they manage cash. So it goes from systems, data, the way you look at performance, how you make sure that your organization is aligned so that you are not only optimizing your bottom line from a financial perspective, but your bottom line from a carbon perspective. And so that's the change that needs to happen to get at scale with the right people.
Thank you. And then finally, we're going to see relatively rapid incremental change in many parts of the economy, but where do you all think we'll see exponential growth and transformative fundamental shifts? Mr. Lee, let's start with you.
We resolutely believe that energy supplies in the future will be much cleaner at more and more affordable prices. Meanwhile, more clean energy will be produced with clean energy itself, which will help to reverse the current ecosystem. With this backdrop, we believe sectors such as energy storage and hydrogen energy will undertake rapid development as part of the wider energy transition. While energy supplies become cleaner and less expensive, sectors such as seawater, desalination, water recycling, and long-distance water piping will also experience rapid development. In parallel, technologies like energy internet, smart grid, and water recycling will also see faster progress, thanks to cleaner energy and reduced energy cost. I believe it is these such sectors that will undoubtedly witness exponential and transformative growth in the near future, while also bringing even more convenience and prosperous outcomes to humankind. Thank you all.
Thank you. Matthias.
Well, built on really trends of technology maturity, evolution of the behaviors, how we live, how we move, how we work. I really see three examples of massive opportunities that I'm personally excited about. There's one around digitalization, obviously all very true before the pandemic, even more after and through the confinement that we all experience. And really, how do you reconcile that growth and the need for more infrastructure in a net zero manner? Net zero data centers. What do you think about 5G deployment to do that in a neutral way? So that's one key area where I see a lot of opportunities. Second, the transportation. People need to be able to move around without hurting the planet. And so, decarbonization of transportation led by the maturation of electric mobility, the decreasing cost of technologies, their batteries, and it's a mass impact on our lives. And air quality in the cities, the pollution in our urban centers. And so, with that, the decarbonization of the electric system, if you want to really have a 100% decarbonized transportation system. And finally, there's really an intriguing space around the value of carbon that I believe will shift, especially around this notion of carbon sinks, nature-based or technology-based solution to store more carbon. Because at the end of the day, for any activities, there are residual emissions, and you need to be able to compensate that. And so that market is not super mature, honestly, in terms of quality and quantity. And when you see the number of corporations that are willing to go carbon neutral in the next years, we need a fundamental shift in that space. And I believe there are going to be opportunities on that front. So really, those three areas, I believe, are going to be crucial for the next decade to build a decarbonized world.
Great, thank you. Rebecca.
I loved Mathias's list. I would add to it huge breakthroughs in biology. I think pretty soon we're going to be growing meat in vats in ways that we would never expect. But your question and our conversation reminds me of a quote by the great biologist E.O. Wilson, who said the problem with humanity is we have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. So I'm not worried about the technical progress. I think humans are infinitely resourceful. The exponential growth and change I'm hoping for is in our institutions and our emotions. I think we have the beginnings of a worldwide climate movement. We have the beginnings of the institutional solution to it. But I think we need to scale that up really quickly. And I am hopeful that it will happen. I think the terrible moment we're in may paradoxically help us to move much more rapidly on climate. we have seen that nature can bite back, that a major pandemic can bring our society not to its knees, but at least to cause some serious hiccups. So I am hoping for a massive social and political mobilization to address climate change.
Thank you. And that's a great quote. Marc, finish us off.
Yeah, I would call out three things. The first one is the data and digital solutions. And if you just compare the effort that goes into measuring and monitoring financial capital, and you compare that with the efforts on natural capital, be it carbon emitters, carbon sinks, or biodiverse forest, you realize there's a lot of truth in the phrase that you treasure what you measure. And, and as a society, I think we have very poorly understood the relationship between these capitals and the importance of the capital. But fortunately, I mean, satellite technology and big data is actually changing that. Whether you consider Al Gore's announcement on the space or the WBCD value chain carbon transparency pathfinder, which will help consumers understand their personal carbon footprint, or the work that Unilever, for instance, is doing on Orbital Insight, that is a real-time monitoring of the first mile in deforestation-free commodity change. I think there's a shared belief that we will have more and we will have better than we will have open data, and that will be, the combination of that will be a big strategic enabler. The second point is biotech. Rebecca already made that point, and whether it's making meats in a laboratory or finding new plant-based material to turn into meats and other kinds of food, or whether it's, let's say, turning plant-based materials into chemicals for cleaning or products or washing your hair or whatever, the biotech industry plays a significant role in the reduction of emissions in the world. And the last thing I would call out is the industry, because of course this is climate week, and so we talk about the climate, and that is important, but the solutions need to be really considered from an integrated perspective. We don't have enough money or time to address all of that separately. It is the two sides of the same coin. And focused on 2021, we have the climate COP, we have the biodiversity COP, we have the UN Food System Summit. But in 2022, we also have the Rio Plus 30 Summit, which is really kind of the halfway point on where are we on these sustainable development goals, against our 2030 deadline. And we need to spend more time between now and then to identify and drive the solutions that accelerate some multiple benefits, such as supporting smallholders and farmers in their roles of retraining fossil fuel industry workers in new high growth sectors of carbon capture or renewable energy generation. And so the only sustainable solution in our view to make sure that this transition is done in a socially just and a socially inclusive manner. And so we need to keep an eye on that, and we call that integrated sustainability. We should not forget that, I believe.
Thank you. And thank you all so much for this fantastic opening ceremony panel today. It's been really great to have this global panel coming together, and thank you all again for joining us. Hello everyone. Today I'm joined by Doug McMillon, the President and CEO of Walmart Inc. Doug has worked at Walmart for nearly 30 years, starting as an hourly employee unloading trucks and serving in senior leadership roles in all of Walmart's business segments, including President and CEO of Walmart International and President and CEO of Sam's Club. Now, one of the reasons you're here today is to tell us some pretty big news. I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Helen. I'm really honored to be here today. As we've already heard throughout this morning's session, it's clear we're in a climate crisis. People used to say we're on the verge, but the sad truth is it's here. The evidence is all around us, in the air we breathe, the ground we walk on, and the world we share. Ice sheets are collapsing, extreme weather events are increasing, oceans are acidifying, and biodiversity is decreasing. Too often, our days are marked by dire news of a climate crisis in hyperdrive. And our hearts go out to all those impacted by the devastating fires in California, Oregon, and Washington, and recent hurricanes. At Walmart, we've been working for the past 15 years to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in our operations and across our supply chain. We've made significant progress on sustainability, as have many other companies. Our focus on climate, waste, nature, and people has paid off in measurable ways, but it's not enough. Collectively, we must do more. Today, I'm excited to announce 2 new commitments our company's making to help combat climate change and reverse nature loss. The first is targeting zero emissions in our own operations by 2040, not just in the US, but globally. And we plan to pull a number of levers to do this without relying on carbon offsets. We aim to harvest enough wind, solar, and other energy sources to power our facilities with 100% renewable energy by 2035. And we think we can get to zero emissions by moving to cooling equipment that uses low-impact refrigerants and electrifying our heating equipment and vehicles, including long-haul trucks, by 2040. Second, along with the Walmart Foundation, we're committing to help protect, manage, and restore at least 50 million acres of land and 1 million square miles of ocean by 2030. We'll focus on critical landscapes that help produce food and other consumer products. And we'll do this by aiming to improve how products are sourced, promoting the adoption of nature-friendly policies and certifications, continue supporting preservation efforts, and investing in place-based partnerships that combine conservation, restoration, and sustainable management.
Congratulations, that's incredibly impressive news. Why these commitments now, Doug?
We must dramatically change the future. And this is the decade that matters. In order to truly stabilize climate, the world needs to do more. In addition to reducing emissions, we need to draw carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and bring it back home. For the past 40 years, one of the most powerful ways to reverse global warming has been largely overlooked. Scientists tell us that protecting, restoring, and better managing forests, oceans, and grasslands could provide a third of the solution to climate change. Our natural systems are changing, and what they're telling us is we're not doing enough. We're actually doing irreversible damage to our planet. The commitments we're making today not only aim to decarbonize Walmart's global operations, they also put us on a path to becoming a regenerative company dedicated to placing nature and humanity at the center of our business practices.
Great. Can you tell me a little bit about Walmart's sustainability journey to this point?
Sam Walton founded Walmart in 1962, so we're 58 years old now. We've learned that as companies grow and mature, just like most human beings, our mindset and perspective changes. One window of time when our company's mindset broadened was about 15 years ago when we made a significant commitment to sustainability. It came at an inflection point in our company's history. After going through a period of listening to critics, learning from thought leaders, and experiencing the emotional and inspirational impact of our actions to serve those hit hard by Hurricane Katrina, we decided to step up. We realized then that our scale and unique strengths could make a positive, outsized difference for communities. And we set 3 overarching goals: to achieve 100% renewable energy, create zero waste, and support a more sustainable supply chain. Since 2005, we've been collaborating with others to drive positive change across global supply chains. Our sustainability efforts prioritize people and the planet by aiming to source responsibly, sell sustainable products, protect natural resources, and reduce waste and emissions. Today, we power around 29% of our operations with renewable energy and divert about 80% of our waste from landfills and incineration globally. In 2016, Walmart was the first retailer to announce a science-based target to align with the Paris Climate Agreement, which we recently upgraded to the highest level of ambition. And just this year, Walmart topped CDP's A list for climate. Because most of our company's environmental impact comes from our supply chain, we're also working with suppliers through our Project Gigaton initiative with the goal of avoiding a gigaton of greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. More than 2,300 suppliers have signed on, and since the effort launched in 2017, suppliers report a total of 230 million metric tons of avoided emissions. Our suppliers deserve a lot of credit for what's been done so far and for what we're going to go do together next. We're experiencing firsthand the strength of shared value, or a multi-stakeholder approach to business. We've become convicted that if a company takes the long-term view, addressing the needs of customers, associates, suppliers, communities, and the planet, more value is created for everyone, including shareholders. It's not a question of or. We're thinking in terms of and. We do these things as part of our business strategy, not a separate set of initiatives.
Great. And what does the future of sustainability at Walmart look like?
We need to stop thinking in terms of sustainability as as it is understood and practiced today. Instead, our goal needs to be aimed at regeneration. Regeneration means restoring, renewing, and replenishing in addition to conserving natural resources. It means decarbonizing operations and eliminating waste along the product chain. It means adopting regenerative practices in agriculture, forest management, and fisheries, while advancing prosperity and equity for customers, associates, and people across supply chains. I'll close with 3 points to keep in mind as we move toward a more regenerative future. First, too often the needs of people and living systems are seen as conflicting priorities. They're not. The world has to stop framing our challenges in terms of either or. It's not a question of either taking action on the climate or creating economic growth, or protecting forests or addressing hunger. The fact is, the future of communities and the natural world are intertwined. Again, we're talking about both. Social equity and economic prosperity depend on the planet's natural systems. Our goal must be to restore the complex network of relationships between nature and humanity that are essential for people to thrive and achieve equity and prosperity. It's important to mention fossil fuels here. Science has clearly pointed to the fact that fossil fuel combustion is a primary cause of warming, and experience suggests we can grow renewable energy, create jobs, and expand economic opportunity. So let's move past the or debate and get on with an urgent and strategy until we've innovated our way off of fossil fuels. Second, the world is not going to return to normal. But that's not a bad thing, because the disruption we're facing now is giving us an opening, an opportunity to analyze, review, and reset. Along with long-term challenges, the pandemic has taught us an important lesson. When each of us takes action together, we can bend a curve, but it takes each of us. No matter who you are, the role you play matters. What will you do if you're watching today? This is a watershed moment in history where all of humanity is coming together, whether we realize it or not. The third and last point I'll make is related to what I just mentioned, partnership. The work ahead requires learning and commitment from each of us. It doesn't mean being right in a way that makes others wrong. It means listening intently and respectfully. It means action that is courageous and fearless. The crises we face is not a science problem, it's a human problem. Technologies are important, but the ultimate power to change the world does not reside in them alone. It relies first and foremost on reverence, respect, and compassion for ourselves, for our people, and the natural environment that sustains us all. This is regeneration, and this is what I commit Walmart to do.
Doug, thank you so much for sharing this inspiring announcement with us here at the opening ceremony of Climate Week NYC.
This year, Climate Week NYC is asking the question, how to build a better future? What role does money play in that? Even before the financial shock that the COVID-19 pandemic ushered in, it was clear that financial institutions would be instrumental in making the transformation needed to tackle climate change. Money steered us here, with a global economy based on the burning of fossil fuels. Now, can money get us to a new kind of global economy? Helen Clarkson is joined by 3 people who are right there at that intersection for this panel entitled The Role of Finance in a Green Recovery.
Welcome to this panel on the role of finance and the green recovery. I'm joined by Kristalina Georgieva, Managing Director of the IMF, Dickon Pinner, Senior Partner at McKinsey & Company, and Fiona Reynolds, CEO of the UN PRI. Let's start with our first question. Are you optimistic about a green recovery? Kristalina.
Yes, I am. And I'm optimistic for 3 reasons. One, we are now more sober after the shock of the pandemic, recognizing we live in a more shock-prone world and we need to build resilience for the future. 2, we have this unique opportunity to pour in the economy a massive stimulus And it is just common sense that we use the money to build the economy of tomorrow, not to return to where we were yesterday. And three, we are seeing in the stimulus already in place, green shoots appearing. Investment in, for example, electric vehicles, climate resilient infrastructure, encouraging less carbon intensive industries. We are at the point when we can do forward planning for the financing that we are going to provide. And we have plenty of opportunities to marry green with job rich, starting from investment in land degradation, reforestation, building insulation. These are all things that are good for climate, but they're also good for jobs at the time when so many jobs in contact intensive industries have disappeared. It is not going to fall from the sky. We have to work for it. And at the IMF, we are providing the analytical underpinning as to why a green recovery is robust and it is better for the world we are going to live in.
Thank you. Dickon.
Thank you. I am also optimistic about a green recovery, but with some caution, and my optimism varies quite a bit by region. Ultimately, this is all about capital allocation and reallocation. So let's start where that's working well, which is in OECD markets. In OECD markets, we see capital markets are wide open, and the cost of capital has never been lower for greenfield deployments of mature, clean technologies. And I'd mention three things. One, historically low interest rates, which favor clean technologies, which replace OPEX with CAPEX. Two, and very importantly, on the risk front, transition risk is beginning to be priced into public equities, probably more than most people realize. And if you look at the terminal value of many carbon-intensive assets, some of those now are close to zero. And the role of energy companies in capital markets has actually shrunk dramatically. I think 40 years ago, they made up something like 29% of the S&P 500. Now it's about 2%. So their ability to track capital has gone down. And then thirdly, on the reward side, the opportunity, as Kristalina mentioned, of clean technologies representing a big opportunity to investors is becoming really quite clear now, including a good fit with things like pension fund money to sustainable infrastructure, the emergence of a whole set of companies that are now kind of $10 billion market cap instead of $1 to $2 billion market cap. So put all together, the risk-reward equation has flipped. Carbon-intensive investments that used to be seen as safe are now seen as risky, and the clean alternatives that were seen as risky, I think, are now seen as safe. And I think this is a structural change. But I should also just, on the caution side, just mention one or two things. One, the installed base is not transitioning nearly at the speed it needs to, the brown to green transition. And that's partly because it depends on a new wave of technologies like hydrogen, ammonia, CCS, and there is massive sort of inertia in the system associated with these long-lived assets. Two, yes, transition risk is exiting the public markets, but it is shifting to private markets and to sovereign investors, which are generally less transparent. So with few exceptions where some of the marginal assets are being retired, risk is often being transferred, not mitigated. The assets don't disappear. And I'd say private capital, we have to try and make that flow more to non-OECD geographies, which is where so much of the action is. And then finally, I think we needed to do a better job of pricing physical risk. I think we're doing a good job of pricing transition risk, but physical risk is still not being priced where it should be. And I think markets like insurance markets probably need to play more of a role to mitigate and not just transfer risk. So a balanced view, a lot of optimism in OECD markets, but a need to transition the installed base and get capital to flow to non-OECD countries.
Thank you. Fiona.
So, well, I agree with everything that's been said. I actually feel pretty optimistic. At the beginning of COVID-19, working in the space that I do, in the investment space, I had so many people who said to me, surely ESG issues, climate are now going to be off the agenda while companies focus on the immediate crisis and putting in place their crisis management plans. And I've actually found the opposite, in that I have never seen the investment community so engaged on these issues, and particularly climate being at the front, but across a whole range of sustainability issues. And far from seeing companies stopping engaging on climate, we've actually seen the opposite. So we have an initiative that's called Climate Action 100 Plus. It's the biggest ever investor to company engagement on climate change that's ever happened. 500 investors who represent 47 trillion in assets under management, with some very clear asks to the 100 largest emitting companies in the world. And during this period, we've seen significant announcements on climate, on net zero ambitions from BP, Shell, Total, etc. So we're seeing these things accelerate. We're definitely not seeing that climate is falling off the agenda.
Thank you. And that's great to hear that, actually, because it's really similar to what we've heard from our own member companies. We surveyed them recently and asked them how they saw climate. And it's really good to hear that what we heard from them is being reflected in your work with investors. So let's move on to the next question. What's the role of global finance in a green recovery? And maybe you can start on that, Fiona.
Sure. Well, I think obviously the governments alone are not going to be able to fund the transition to net zero, nor are they going to be able to fund the response from COVID-19. So the private sector role is hugely important. When it comes to the investment community, we've really got 4 key levers. So first is in the corporate engagement. So I mentioned Climate Action 100 Plus, a great example how investors can use their position as major shareholders to bring about green changes to business. Then, of course, secondly, there is in the investments that investors make themselves. And so with UNEP-FI, our sister organisation, last year we created the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance. We've got 29 very large asset owners who are part of this. This is all about them committing to net zero themselves across their entire portfolio. So the investments they make themselves, and as well as setting the 2050 target, about setting midterm targets for 2025. Then, of course, there's the work that investors do in working with policymakers on the recovery. So really advocating with governments that we need this recovery to be green, to be sustainable, and to be just. And then there's the whole side about disclosure. So we're very much focused on how do we get good disclosure about what investors and companies are doing on climate change through the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, and just recently through some new work on how do we get climate to be translated into financial accounts. And all of these things are taking place.
Great, thank you. Dickon, same question to you.
Global finance has already been mobilized at some scale here, and I would agree with Fiona's comments. I think the increased transparency through organizations like the UNPRI, TCFD, SBDI, etc., incredibly important. I think the role of the regulator nudging banks and asset managers to recognize climate risk has been incredibly helpful. And I think we're also seeing new financing structures better align the pools of risk capital with the opportunity. And it turns out the fit here between these pools of capital and the opportunity are very synergistic. Pension fund is looking for the type of yield coming from sustainable infrastructure. We're beginning to see things like, the PPA, the power purchase agreement that was applied to solar, being applied to all forms of distributed infrastructure. And interesting other novel things like in the US, obviously the sort of SPAC phenomena, but that's beginning to play an interesting role in ESG too. So yeah, I think we're quite excited. I think we also see things like the need to scale voluntary carbon markets. The demand we're seeing from the industrial sector for offsets is huge, but the supply is still somewhat limited, and there are quite a few pain points across the value chain. That requires transparency, certification, verification, etc. But things like the task force for voluntary carbon markets are beginning to address that, and obviously those markets at 40 gigatons a year, probably close to $1 trillion annual market potentially are huge. So yeah, we're beginning to see quite a bit of mobilization of the capital markets.
Great. And could you talk about the role of global business in the financing of a green recovery? Kristalina.
It is very important to recognize that business has a huge role to play. We are projecting, for example, for low carbon transition in energy, that we would need some $2.3 trillion a year for the next decade. Obviously, that can only happen if private investments are mobilized. And for that, we see two very critical steps that policymakers need to take. The first one is to put the right price on carbon. If we take the world today, on average, a ton of carbon is priced at $2. If we are to reach the Paris Agreement, the price of carbon should go up to $75 a ton. Obviously, that cannot be done in one jump, but forward guidance by policymakers of the direction to travel would be very important to actually put an incentive for investment to follow that signal and then help us address the problem of carbon emissions. The second aspect on the private sector side is something that was touched upon, and it is standards for disclosure. Right now, we are doing better in the disclosure of transitional risks, but it is not mandatory. And we still have a way to go to price the risk of natural disasters. So if we want business to do its part, we have to help with this signaling, and we have to imagine a road towards more mandatory disclosure. Of course, it's not going to happen overnight, but that is where we need to go. I also want to bring in this discussion something else that is related to money, and it is financing a just transition. We talk about the businesses that are leaping into the future, but we also have to worry about the businesses that are stuck in yesterday and how to help them to unstuck, how to help workers in coal industries to find their new jobs and new opportunities, how to support that within countries and across countries. And I am very keen to see us honestly talking about this problem of an economy that is high carbon. How can it transition in a way that also creates the political support everywhere?
Great, thank you. And actually, that's a really good segue into my next question, which was going to be that we're going to be talking later about building a better future. Who should foot the bill for a just transition? Let me go back to you on that one, Kristalina.
Well, when we look at the two things I talked about, carbon price and just transition, there is a clear bridge that can be built between those two. If we are to generate more revenues through carbon price, whether it is through direct tax or it is trade that also leads to some increase in revenues, this is a very potent source for us to underpin the just transition. And I also believe very strongly that when we have businesses that are doing extremely well in this crisis, they can be a source of stability, so we can see the whole world moving forward at a time when it's an opportunity absolutely not to be missed. We won't have another chance like this one anytime soon. Interest rates low, governments investing fiscal stimulus on scale. If we take that forward and bring everybody with us, we can have a world that is much more vibrant, and it is at the same time more inclusive and fairer world.
Thank you. And Fiona, I want to give you the last word on this one too.
Yeah, so one of the things that I think the people who definitely can't be left to pay the price for climate change has to not be the workers of the world who work in the fossil fuel sector. And in actual fact, if we don't tackle the just transition, then I'm convinced climate change won't actually happen, because people are not going to vote in a way that is against their interest in many cases. And we see this polarisation around the world in countries where people feel that they are going to be left behind. And you can understand if people feel like, I won't have a job, how am I going to feed my family? So this to me has something where governments, business, investors and workers and all their representatives come together and work out a solution. And we see in some countries like Germany that there is a plan. There's a just transition fund. There's a plan for how you do this over a time period. Workers have got some certainty. I think we also know that what is it that every government in the world needs at the moment? It needs to create jobs. And we need to be able to convince governments that the new job creation is in the green economy, and that there are so many areas that we can create new green jobs in, whether that's in energy efficiency, whether it's changes in agricultural practices, whether it's in new energies, and that if we did use the money, as was said before, from a decent price on carbon or through fossil fuel subsidies, we could actually put money into a significant just transition fund. And I think there's so much really great work that could be done here.
And Dickon, did you want to come in on that point?
Yeah, I mean, maybe just linking it back, or the comment, Fiona's comment about the just transition and jobs as part of it, and I think it links back to your question on business. I think 12 months ago we saw that many businesses were significantly overexposed to the risk and underexposed to the opportunity, and I think today business is now getting ahead of financing the recovery. And just a snapshot, right? Growth in energy markets is now being driven by tech and RE100, which are driving aggressive renewables deployment. Pension funds and other long-dated assets are financing renewables. Asset-backed security markets are delivering things like rooftop solar at record cost. And I think we're seeing sort of three important shifts. One in the pandemic, which I think are important. One is in the pandemic, we're seeing companies shed many of their sort of marginal, more inefficient assets. Things like, airlines are sending inefficient planes to the desert, never to return. The highest methane polluting assets in the Permian are getting shut down. And as Kristalina said, the pandemic has also spurred an increased recognition of risk and the need for resiliency. We're seeing a lot of activity around supply chain resiliency, and big companies now are actually beginning to do the physical risk assessments. Importantly, recognizing it is not their assets that are at risk in many cases. It is the communities and the supply chains around them that are exposed. And that is important to them as it should be. The second one is we see innovation is just everywhere. It's not just technology. Yes, the next generation green hydrogen and ammonia, fuel cells, etc., negative emissions technologies, etc. They're all coming in, but we're seeing new value propositions. You know, resilience may not be priced into capital markets, but it does actually sell now. Attach rates of batteries are skyrocketing. Microgrids are selling. And we're seeing things like the emergence of zero carbon products as a thing. A lot of new financing mechanisms. And as we talked about earlier, a significant, demand for offsets, et cetera. So, we're encouraged about the role that business is playing. And I think that we've seen a big shift in the last 12 months, and that, should pull through a lot of economic activity. Because as we know, the stimulus associated with the situation, but state budgets are going to be depleted. So the role of private capital here is going to be hugely important. And I think business is taking a real role in sort of stepping up to help fix the problem.
Traditionally, jobs in many of the fossil fuel sectors in working class areas have been really good jobs. So they've been high paying, they've had pensions, they've had medical and saying to people in the job in the warehouse for minimum wages with no safety nets is not going to cut it. When we create new jobs, they have to be good jobs with good protections as well.
I just want to say that a huge investment we ought to make is in people, in education and skills, and ability to adjust to be more adaptable to this fast-moving world of tomorrow. And I think it is important to talk about that, not just about the physical investments that are necessary.
Thank you, and that was a really great last word to end on there. So thanks again just to all of you for joining us for this panel. I really want to thank you, and thank you for bringing your optimism, and I'm really looking forward to working with you as we work to build a better future. Thank you.
It's fair to say that financial institutions, businesses, lawmakers in local, state, and national governments are increasingly facing public pressure in recent years. Young people have taken to the streets all over the world by the millions. There's been shareholder pressure in annual meetings. Lawsuits have been filed against oil and gas companies. The youth climate movement has adapted to the reality of lockdowns by moving protests online, to mainstream politics, and into the courtrooms. Expect more youth-led street demonstrations worldwide this coming Friday, September 25th. Please welcome our panelists for Building a Better Future. We have with us Marc Chambers from the New York City Mayor's Office of Sustainability, joining from New York City, and Tamara Toles O'Loughlin, North America Director for the activist organization 350.org. So welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Glad to be here.
You know, like COVID, the climate crisis really lifts the lid on the underlying social inequities, the underlying racism deeply embedded in our societies. I wonder if this moment prompts you to, re-examine your strategies, both as a city official and as as a leader of an activist organization. Who wants to take that first?
Well, I wouldn't be an activist if I didn't want to take it first. So I'll jump in and say that for us, it changes our agenda not at all. 350.org has been focused for a really long time on messaging that climate justice is in fact racial justice in order to build a multiracial, multi-generational movement that really speaks to the problem, gets us to scale, and takes up science and justice so that we have a democracy that actually responds to it. We cannot do this in silos. We can't do it without Black people, without Indigenous people, without people of color, without youth, and without the energy and wisdom exchange that happens when folks operate in a space at the same time. So our recent public dialogue around this needing to happen is only an extension of years of work that we have been doing as a learning organization that's always focused on building the broader movement, which isn't just about white people.
Marc Chambers, I want to ask you, given that the city has taken an enormous economic hit from the coronavirus pandemic, what does this do to the city's ambition to meet its climate targets? And I can tell you as a New Yorker, the streets are really packed again. There is no congestion tax yet. The garbage pickup, no longer picks up food scraps anymore. So concretely, what do you think this does to New York City's climate targets?
Well, look, the climate targets are set based on a species level crisis. So we are moving towards all of our carbon reduction goals without pause. We know that there has been an incredible shock to both the budgets and the economy because of the COVID crisis, but we will move past this. And it requires us to have steel in our spine to be able to know that food scraps will be collected again, like that will happen again. And right now, it also reinforces the notion that there is an inextricable link between the work we're doing on climate and the work we're doing to combat social inequality. So the work we do when we say that there are additional loads that are being felt by New Yorkers based on race or gender identity or class or disability or even immigration status, like those loads build up and make it difficult for us to galvanize the resources and the amount of people we need to really meet this crisis. So we have to be investing and doing the hard work now of combating social inequality so that we can actually be in a place to be able to combat the climate crisis effectively when everything comes back online. But we're not deterred. We are not moving our deadlines. We are doubling down on the work that's going to need to be done, knowing that we're going to have a shorter time period to do it. But I will say that's the amazing part of policy, is that we put things in place that have really critical timelines, like the Local Law 97, which we passed here to set the first of its kind global cap on emissions for large buildings. That's going to come into effect one way or another, and that will help. Those types of policies is exactly how we're going to get the city back on track and be an emblem for other cities that need to get back on track after we deal with the pandemic.
Do you think the congestion tax will go into effect by the end of this year as planned?
Honestly, I think that everything is being reevaluated. A lot of information that we're seeing from the congestion works that's been happening in the UK is informing whether or not the same model that was anticipated or kind of being thought of for New York City is going to be applicable. We also have to really kind of confront ridership and the notion that we need to be having a significant reduction in the amount of vehicles that are moving around the city. You've seen, as you mentioned, that car ridership has been up. That is something that we really need to tackle so that we can move towards a car optional city as opposed to simply layering on a congestion pricing scheme that doesn't always get at the core issue.
Tamara, you have heard a lot of companies, a lot of cities and states set carbon neutrality or net zero targets. Some of them are for 2030, some of them are for 2050. How are you thinking about that now? Is net zero enough? How do we all need to think about net zero? And by when?
Net zero is not enough. We actually need to go further. Some of the questions that you presented to Marc around how the pandemic has really been an open window on what we do not know, and about how humanity itself is being put into a syndemic moment, multiple pandemics happening at once that cripple our systems. The reason we've gotten behind big ideas like a Green New Deal for jobs, infrastructure, and human health is because we pay for these things anyway. So focusing on the question of whether or not a specific benchmark in one part of the big conversation around how we deal with jobs, infrastructure, and human health is not as important as setting really aggressive targets around our decoupling of our relationship from fossil fuel infrastructure, which is a huge driver of every part of this, from the first mile to the last mile. We would call him a key perpetrator in climate deception. That's not an accident. That's not a faulty choice of words or because it's sensational. It's because net zero must work well with food systems that actually support people, with infrastructure that gives folks options to become car free or live in a neutral footprint. So yes, we need to be aggressive. 2030 sounds like a number we feel better about. Some of the most aggressive stances in almost every sector are 2035 or really unworkable in 2050. So I think the more important question is, when do we draw the line about whether we choose to continue on as a species or not? And if the answer is we punt it to 2035, then we've given up the fight altogether. So we do need to be more focused on how we're benchmarking buildings, our relationships to one another, how we move transportation, whether or not there is food, and whether or not Black, Indigenous, and migrant communities, people who are now the working poor, have 2 and 3 jobs, are at the center of climate action planning.
I want to just do a real lightning round with the both of you. Given the fires and the flooding that you're seeing this week in the United States, what is the one thing that you think must be done from where you sit? One thing that must be done this year. Just one thing, very quickly, please. Marc?
I think it's important for New York City, where we have the lion's share of our greenhouse gas emissions come from being able to heat and cool our buildings. We have to double down on the work that we're doing to reduce the impact that they're having on our contribution to the climate crisis. All that we're seeing unfold, whether it is from increased storms or all of the allostatic loads that come from the additional crisis that individuals are facing, we have to get at the core of it. And in New York City, that has a lot to do with the buildings that we are now reevaluating because of the COVID crisis. You know, the space that we take up is important.
So for you, Marc, it's plugging the leaks in the building and in the buildings and figuring out how to reduce building emissions. Tamara, please.
Yeah, 3 words: make them pay. New York has an AG who's already taken a run at this. Baltimore City, Colorado, and now Charleston, amongst a litany of places who are recognizing that we didn't cause this damage. There are folks who have a lot of filthy money that could help us fix it and get on track for good emissions, focusing on giving people the opportunity to relocate, real change. All of that has to be empowered by working together, mobilizing across our various constituencies and beyond partisanship, and really empowering AGs to call the question on folks who are trafficking within and beyond state lines, causing a bunch of damage and then escaping with their profits. So if we're not able to pull down the levers of folks who are being harmed at the level of the municipality and the city and the county level to deal with what is coming by giving them enough funding to make real choices, we're failing. So yeah, make them pay. It's time to call the question on fossil fuel capitalism.
We are straight out of time. I want to thank both of you from sharing your thoughts, both from inside the halls of power and from outside trying to make the change. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. We'll see you inside.
Thank you, Somini. You've been a fantastic host and we've loved having you here. What an event. An agenda-setting corporate announcement, 2 fantastic panels, an insightful in-conversation piece, and a keynote from HOH Prince Charles. Before we close the event, I'd like to take a moment to thank our sponsors. This year, they came forward to support this event when we weren't even sure what it was going to look like, because they knew that our community would need to come together in some way. I cannot express enough our gratitude for your faith in us to deliver Climate Week NYC in a new and untested way. We truly could not have done it without you. Secondly, I'd like to thank my team at the Climate Group. It's not been an easy year, but once again, you've succeeded in delivering a pivotal moment in our collective calendar. There are many people that are never seen by our speakers and attendees that hold this event together in the background. Thank you particularly to them. And finally, I'd like to thank those of you speaking at, listening to and engaging in any way with Climate Week NYC this year. Thank you for turning up and getting involved, for being willing to try something different this year, and for standing with us at this time. Remember, you've got 29 quarantines to make a difference. Don't waste them. We're going to have a short break, and then I'll be right back to introduce our next event, COP26 and the Clean Growth Agenda. Goodbye.
Thank you, Helen. And thanks to all of the speakers and panelists who have joined us today, as well as all of you at home or in your office for participating. You can watch all of the events from Climate Week NYC on the Climate Group's Facebook Watch channel, and from the Climate Week NYC website and mobile phone app, you'll be able to join over 400 events taking place across the week online from New York City and around the world. That includes an event sponsored by the New York Times called The New Zero Carbon Normal for Cities. That's on September the 22nd. Thank you so much for joining us.